Before the break, we talk about glycolysis. Glycolysis, this is summary, happens in cytosol. It does not require oxygen. So it's a quick process. What's the beginning? What's the end? Beginning is start from one glucose. And through the whole glycolysis, you produce 2 pyruvate, or sometimes called pyruvic acid, pyruvate. The other product, 2 ATP and 2 NADH and 2 hydrogen, 2 protons, H+. Okay, so know the input, know the output. Okay, now the second big step, citric acid cycle, also called Krebs cycle. And from the second step, it happened in mitochondria. And to start the second step, there's a small problem. The problem is citric acid cycle is start from a 2-carbon molecule. And pyruvate is a 3-carbon. So before the pyruvate can really go into the citric acid cycle, you have cut 1 carbon away. That's a small technical difficulty. So this is pyruvate, right? We talk about this. This is a product of glycolysis. And then you need to go into citric acid cycle. There's a 2-carbon. Here you see 2-carbon. So they actually have to have the intermediate step, which is to turn the 3-carbon pyruvate into 2-carbon called acetyl-CoA. And you cut 1 carbon away, okay? When you cut this 1 carbon away, you see here, this blue one is CO2. So your CO2 is released. You find we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2. CO2 come from here. Every living cell do this. CO2 come from here. So this is called the intermediate step. Intermediate step is turn the pyruvate, which is 3-carbon molecule, into acetyl-CoA, which is 2-carbon. So you release CO2, and you have the NADH. You produce NADH and hydrogen. And when we count it, because we start from 1 glucose, so after this, 1 glucose produce 2 pyruvate. So remember, when we count how many total ATP, how many NADH, we have to count, we have to multiply everything by 2, because 1 glucose produce 2 pyruvate. Okay, so this intermediate step, turn pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. Now it starts in the mitochondria. Oops. And require oxygens, begin from 2 pyruvate, turn into 2 acetyl-CoA, product 2 NADH, 2 H+, 2 proton, and 2 CO2. So I told you, because we start from 1 glucose. So from now on, everything multiplied by 2, it produces 2 pyruvate. And know the input is 2 pyruvate, and know the output 2 acetyl-CoA, 2 NADH, 2 proton, and 2 CO2. Okay, now let's go into the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle is a cycle, it just keep going. This cycle in mitochondria is just keep going. The whole process, I won't ask you each one of them. That's when you take the biochem, you will learn those details. I want you to know, okay, what's the meaning of this process? What's the input? What's the output? Input, of course, acetyl-CoA. And in this citric acid cycle, its whole process is to add carbon and then cut carbon away, and then cut carbon away, and then add carbon. So that's the process of citric acid cycle. It just keep going. So your acetyl-CoA can add into the citric acid cycle because your acetyl-CoA has 2 carbon. So originally, you have a molecule which has 4 carbon, then you add acetyl-CoA, become a 6 carbon. And then you start to cut carbon away. So you cut the carbon away, release the CO2, right? The carbon is released as CO2. And then you cut a carbon away, you release another CO2. And in this whole process, it does not produce too many ATP. It only produces 2. But it also produces a lot of NADH and FADH2. Remember, I told you these are electron carrier. So in the last step, these NADH, FADH2, those electron carrier, will eventually go into the oxidative phosphorylation and dump those electrons, turn them into proton first, and then use those protons to produce ATP. So eventually, in the last step, all this hard work payback, produce a lot of ATP. So that's another picture show you the citric acid cycle. You just add carbon, and this picture clearly show you, okay, what happened to the carbon. So these are the carbon. You add acetyl-CoA, 2 carbon into originally 4 carbon molecule. Now you have 6 carbon. That's the citrate. Don't worry about this. I won't ask you the intermediate step. I want you to know the input output. Now these 6 carbons start to cut, right? You cut 1 carbon away, CO2 release. Now it becomes 5 carbon. And you cut another carbon away, it becomes 4. And now you have 4, you make them shape turn a little bit. There's another molecule. Then you add acetyl-CoA, the 4 carbon becomes 6 carbon. They just keep going. That's the citric acid cycle. And in this process, you produce a lot of NADH, FADH2, even though not too many ATP. So let's look at the summation of citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle. It happens in mitochondria. You need oxygen. Now you need oxygen. And then start from 2 acetyl-CoA. Okay, what's the output? Still with 2 acetyl-CoA, because it just keep going. This cycle just keep going. But it produce a lot of this. Let's look at this part. 2 ATP, okay, but 6 NADH, 2 FADH2, 6 proton, 4 CO2. So those 6 NADH and 2 FADH2 eventually, okay, the last step, oxidative phosphorylation, also in mitochondria. And I told you the NADH and FADH2, they are electron carrier. So now this electron gonna go through those machines to turn the electrons into proton. We want proton because the last machine, it's like you go to Chuck E. Cheese. Okay, well you you have those machines, those tickets, right? And each you say every time you have 1 ticket, you can run this machine once. That's what the protons. So protons is the ticket you have. So every time the proton go in, this machine run once, and then it produce 1 ATP. Okay, so that's easy to understand. If you have 30 tickets, you can run this machine 30 times, then you produce 30 ATP. So basically, that's what it means. So eventually, in the first few steps, you produce NADH, FADH2, the electron carrier. And eventually, in the last machine, it's going to turn those, or first turn the electron into proton. And then you have proton. Each proton can run this machine once, produce 1 ATP. So if you have 34 proton, you produce 34 ATP. Okay, that's oxidative phosphorylation. So that's this whole process means. And that's why we like to have the electron carrier in the first few steps. Okay, so those electron carrier from step 1, from step 2, they carry electrons, and then they dump them here, turn the electron into proton. That's the ticket you have. Now you can run the machine. Every time you run the machine, you produce 1 ATP. And you have 2 machines, you run 2. So they just keep going. So in the mitochondria, eventually you produce a lot of ATP. So that's the machine. That's the enzyme ATP synthase. That's the enzyme produce ATP. So every time the proton goes through, you run the machine once, produce 1 ATP. Okay, so let's see how many ATP we produce. A lot. Finally, a lot. So it starts from NADH, FADH2, and the protons, and eventually in the oxidative phosphorylation, you produce 34 ATPs and 4 water. That's why we breathe out not just CO2, also breathe out water. 34 ATPs, that's a lot. So that's the summary of cellular respiration. You start from 1 glucose. In the glycolysis, you only produce 2 ATP. In the citric acid cycle, you produce 2 ATP as well. But the last one, the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, you totally produce 34 ATPs. So from 1 glucose, you actually produce 38 ATPs. And the last few slides, let's talk about, okay, what if you don't eat don't eat carbohydrate. You eat protein, you eat fat. Would you starve to death? The answer is no, you won't. The reason is your body are able to turn lipid, right? Lipid, that's the fat, and protein, amino acid. They can go into the cellular respiration. They can go into the cellular respiration and then still produce ATP. That's why we can use the other energy source. So when we talk about the biomolecules, not just the carbohydrate, it's the process. It can go through glycolysis, citric acid cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. But if you eat lipid and protein, they can still be the energy source. That's why we say these two are still the energy source. Carbohydrate, proteins, and lipids, they're all energy source. So your body are able to use them to produce ATP. And the last 3 slides, let's talk about the metabolisms without oxygen, anaerobic respiration. So one is in the bacteria, in the yeast. They are able to turn the glucose into ATP without oxygen. And this whole process, don't worry about the intermediate step. I just want you to know the name. It's called the fermentation. Know the input, know the output. So input is still glucose. Output, they produce lactic acid, and then you can use it as energy. Let's look here, ethanol. That's how we produce ethanol, alcohol. So this in the yeast means you could not just, well, without oxygen, don't breathe, produce ethanol. You won't. Let's look at in animal cells. Animal cells is called the lactic acid fermentation. Remember we said in the whole cellular respiration, the first process, glycolysis, is without oxygen. You don't need oxygen for this process. You turn 1 glucose into 2 pyruvate. This process is quick, even though you only produce 2 ATP. So when you need a lot of ATP, your cells will go through this process, produce a lot of ATP because it's quick. Take a glucose and you make it symmetric, you cut in the center, become 2, 3 carbon pyruvate. And now you have a lot of pyruvate. They are ready to go to mitochondria, but that process is slow. So say you have 200 pyruvate, okay? And then they are ready to go into mitochondria. You only have 50 can go into mitochondria. So the other 150 will turn into another molecule called lactate, also called lactic acid. That's when you exercise a lot. Your muscle gonna produce a lot of lactic acid, and it make your muscle weak, muscle sore the other day. That's the lactic acid fermentation. This happens in animal cells. And in the plant is fermentation produce alcohol. So this happens in the plant. That's how we produce alcohol. And in animal cells, they have the lactic acid fermentation. That's when both of them are anaerobic respiration, when you don't have enough oxygen and you still need to produce ATP. Okay, that's the cellular respiration. Let's stop here.